Well, hi everyone, this is Mike Shaw with Planit Pro, and today let's talk about the scene mode of the exposure tool of Planit Pro. Well, when would we want to use this? Well, the main benefit is that the scene mode allows you to predetermine your exposure settings for a given scene so that once you're ready to start shooting, your exposure settings are already dialed in. Now, to access the tool, the exposure page is the fourth one under the special interest category right just here. Now, in the last two videos on the subject, we talked about the exposure page where we covered the manual mode and the ND filter mode. This video tutorial is going to cover the scene mode, which we can select right here. Now, you may have noticed that the exposure page generally doesn't really have anything to do with the map below it, or the date or the time and so forth. For example, let's choose the manual mode right here. And as you can see, no matter what I change in the values up in here, there's no effect on the underlying map or anything on it. And in fact, the manual exposure tool is actually an independent module, and some users have even suggested that a separate exposure app be developed by Planit so that this tool with so many useful features doesn't get buried inside the overall Planit Pro version, and this is an option that's certainly being considered. But now, when you switch to the scene mode, things are different, as you'll see. So let's start by looking at the scene description, which we can establish right just here. And this actually uses the selected time to calculate the exposure based on the nature of the ambient light. Now, after you select the scene mode, the first thing is the selection of the EV, or the exposure value. And in this tool, however, you don't need to worry about the actual value of the EV like you did in the manual mode. Instead, all you have to do is simply select the cloud cover condition that your scene has, or if you're shooting a special scene as your subject, as you'll see, and that establishes the appropriate scene EV. Super easy. Now, the reason for considering the cloud cover is that it has such an important effect on the ambient light from the sun. And for the 4 different cloud cover conditions, each one has a one-stop EV difference from the previous one. Now you can also select a special subject. For example, let's suppose you want to shoot a city skyline, or the moon, or the stars in the night sky. Each one of those has an option that you can see here. So let's begin with an example by selecting the cloud cover condition of the clear skies first, and this way you can see how everything works. Now, because it's daytime, you can see that the EV value is 15, and that's shown right up here in parentheses. The exposure settings that you see here are the actual camera settings that you should use to get a perfectly exposed image. And as you can imagine, this is extremely powerful since right in here you can explore the effects of trading off different ISOs, apertures, and shutter speeds. Now, notice that when we adjust the time slider to get closer and closer to sunset, you can see how the EV changes. And specifically, as you get to adjust the time closer and closer to sunset, the EV correspondingly decreases to a lower value. And you can also notice that while the EV is changing, the app calculates the corresponding change in the shutter speed that you need to use to get, again, a perfectly exposed image. And that's because we've chosen the shutter speed to be the automatically calculated exposure parameter, which you can see here in parentheses where it says auto. And what this actually means is that the Planit apps gives you the exact camera settings that you need to take a landscape photo at any time, assuming, of course, that the only light source is the ambient light from natural sources such as the sun and the moon. Now, if we continue adjusting the time until we get total darkness at night, the EV reaches a plateau value of -6, and it stays at this value for the rest of that night. So to recap, at sunset, the change in EV occurs mainly from the beginning of the golden hour, starting all the way through until the sun is around 12 degrees below the horizon, and this is when the astronomical twilight period begins. Now, even though there's a little bit of light left over from the sun in the sky during astronomical twilight, it's really pretty negligible. So what this means is that the app considers the sun elevation angle when it calculates the exposure settings. And yes, in case you're wondering, the map also considers the moon elevation angle. And you can see how that works by simply finding a night with a full moon. So we're going to do that right here. So let's just see if we can, here we go. Here's a night with a full moon. So there we go. Okay. Now on this date, during the daytime, we still have an EV of 15, which makes sense, as you can see right here. But now, look what happens when we change the time towards nighttime. The EV decreases as we expect. But now, because of the light from the full moon, the lowest value that the EV reaches is only -4, compared to -6 in the previous example, where the moon was below the horizon or absent. And you can see this effect on the shutter speed. And right now, the shutter speed is at several minutes. Of course, we don't want to generally shoot that long, but if we change the ISO to a higher value, like this, what we can do, okay, so now we can, when we do that, we can see that we can decrease our shutter speed to a matter of just a few seconds, as you can see right here. Okay, so what this app actually does is to tell you ahead of time the exposure settings that you're going to need for your scene that you're going to shoot at some point in the future. And how accurate are they? Well, of course, keep in mind that they're calculated for ideal conditions. And when you actually shoot, local conditions like air pollution or haze and so forth can have an impact on the overall exposure. So these settings are good for a starting point, and then you can adjust as needed. All right, so now let's talk about the special subjects. For example, let's select the skyline as a subject, and this would be the case for shooting a city skyline. And now when adjusting the time during the day, you can see that the EV is still 15 as it was before. But now when we approach sunset and beyond, the plateau value of the EV is +1, not -4 or -6 like it was before. So what this means is that if we use an ISO of 100 with an aperture of f8, then the shutter speed calculated for a correct skyline exposure is 32 seconds. So you can use these settings the next time you shoot a city skyline at night. And you can also select the full moon as the subject, which you can see right here. And down here you can see this blue line along the bottom here. And this blue line indicates the moon visible period. In other words, whenever the blue line is present, whatever times the blue line is present, that means that the moon is above the horizon. So you can see that right now the moon is still below the horizon, and this is the time right here when the moon rises. Now, since right here, but before moonrise, the EV says the moon not visible, as you can see right up here. But once we adjust the time, like this, until the moon rises, when it's a full moon, we have an EV of 12. Now, to be clear, this means that if you want to shoot the full moon itself as a subject, then the EV of the full moon itself is 12. And, in fact, as you can see here, as the moon rises, so you increase the time, the EV gets higher and higher until we eventually get to an EV of 14 to 15. And this means that the full moon is actually extremely bright, which makes sense because it's simply reflecting the light from the sun. So the EV of 14 to 15 is totally understandable since it's basically the same as the daytime EV of 15. So in other words, when you shoot the full moon by itself, you can use the same exposure settings as a landscape photo during daytime. And as a matter of fact, in the manual mode, you can also select the moon as a subject and see right here, the EV is around 14 to 15 since these two parts are related. Now finally, you can also select stars as your subject. Of course, during daytime it says too bright, but after astronomical twilight and night starts, you can see that the EV for the stars is -5, and you can explore the appropriate settings to use for these conditions. All right, so here are the key conclusions. The scene mode under the exposure feature in Planit Pro is a unique feature that was created by Planit, and at least so far we haven't seen any of the other apps that have the same or similar feature. Now the main benefit to you is that you can then use it to predetermine your exposure settings. So with Planit, you can not only plan for the composition and the time, but also for the exposure. Then when you actually take the photo, you just execute according to the plan, and you'll find everything will be much more efficient. Now, you may wonder, well, why is this so important? And in fact, I'm often asked, why not simply just check the exposure at the time you're doing your shooting? Well, my answer is that oftentimes your shooting window is just too short for that. Sometimes you just don't have a lot of time for a whole amount of trial and error. For example, think of a situation with a long telephoto lens when you're shooting the moonrise. If you don't know the moon exposure settings before the moon actually rises, you then have to estimate them based on any of your prior experiences and then change them on the fly. And as you know, a full moon rising is often only in the perfect position for just a matter of a second or two, and that's much too short of a time for any meaningful exposure adjustments. But instead, with this feature, it becomes possible to find out the moon exposure even before it's visible. So for example, this way you can make a complete time lapse from before when the moon appears to after the moon has completely risen, and all the exposures will be perfectly correct. And the other example is for a Holy Grail time lapse, and this is from a day to night or night to day transition. And what this feature allows you to do is to predetermine the exposures so that you can either control the camera exposures using a remote device or program them into a programmable remote. And later, if you want to then process the shots using LR time-lapse, for example, it becomes much easier. Well, that's it. Once again, this is Mike Shaw with Planit Pro saying thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoy calculating your scene exposures using Planit Pro. Take care.